Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the July membership meeting of the California Native Plant Society Marin Chapter. And tonight we'll have a group of 4 speakers. And the subject is preparing for sea level rise and protecting biodiversity and Chloropyron maritimum, that's birdsbeak populations at Bothin Marsh, which is adjoining Mill Valley on the bay. It's a bayland, wetland. And there'll be a follow-up field trip on July 18th at 10 a.m., which you might be interested in registering for. And the information is in our e-newsletter. And the topic will be an overview of the Evolving Shorelines Project, focusing on the efforts to protect tidal wetland habitat and the population of Chloropyron maritimum subspecies palustre at Bothin Marsh Open Space Preserve. Topics will include fine-scale plant community association level mapping, intro to the biology of Chloropyron, and efforts underway to understand its presence and habitat, and plans for improving marsh habitat and climate change resiliency at the marsh. Our speakers are Julian Geoghegan, and I'll need to have a correct pronunciation given for that surname, who is Vegetation Specialist with the Marin County Parks. Veronica Pearson, who's Senior Ecological Restoration Planner, also with Marin County Parks. Shelly Benson, an Independent Biological Consultant. And Rob LaPorte, Project Manager with the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. And Rob will be running the PowerPoint program for us. And just a little bit of protocol for the meeting. If everyone could stay muted during the talk itself. You can unmute at the end of the talk. And during the program, please feel free to put any questions you might have into the chat. And we can read those out at the end of the presentation. So go ahead, Rob, if you'd like to share your screen and commence the program.
Thank you. I'm just going to turn it over to Veronica to kick us off.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today and share our work at the Bothin Marsh Open Space Preserve in Mill Valley. The preserve is owned and managed by Marin County Parks, and we are working closely with our nonprofit partner, the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, to plan for sea level rise. The Evolving Shorelines Project is a collaborative effort of one TAM to develop a strategy to address the impacts of sea level rise on the preserve. One TAM is the coalition of land management agencies that manage lands in the Mount Tam watershed, and it's led by the Parks Conservancy. Next slide. So we have a packed agenda today, but hopefully we can get all in the time we have and have some time at the end for discussion. But I'm just going to start us off by providing some background and framework on what the Evolving Shorelines Project is. Shelly is going to present to us the tidal marsh vegetation mapping that she has been leading at Bothin, and Julian is going to present the Chloropyron maritimum mapping that our resource department is leading. And then lastly, Rob is going to present the marsh resiliency and habitat enhancement strategies that we are planning for and designing for the open space preserve. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers and discussion at the end. Next slide. Just to orient those of you who might not be familiar where the open space preserve is, we're roughly about 15 miles north of the Golden Gate Bridge. You can see outlined in what is white and yellow here, the extent of the preserve. We're on the east side of Marin County and smack up in Upper Richardson Bay to the west of the 101. Next slide. And this is a bird's eye view of looking at the preserve. you can see in green is actually our open space preserve boundaries. So the Evolving Shorelines Project is based entirely within just our open space lands that Marin County Parks manages. On the west side, the preserve is bisected by the Bay Trail, also known as the Mill Valley Sausalito multi-use path. And it is also surrounded to the south by Coyote Creek, and the McLashin Trail is a connector trail to the Bay Trail to the Tam Valley community. We have Shoreline Highway that comes off of State Route or Highway 101 and eventually becomes Panoramic Highway and State Route 1. And Shoreline also abuts Almonte Boulevard, which also transitions into Miller Avenue to the north of the preserve. And then at the north end of the preserve is the Arroyo Corte Madera del Presidio. So as you can see from this map, we're extremely constrained by development all around our preserve and bay waters to our east. Next slide. So all of that matters, in particular when we start thinking about marsh evolution. And the maps that you're going to see here are based on some studies that we had done in the early 2017. And around 2015, we came to realize with other studies that were being conducted and implemented and published was that there was an extreme risk to the preserve with sea level rise. And a number of reports were commissioned that were led by Laurel Collins and Josh Collins and Peter Bay. Some of you may recognize some of these names. They do a lot of wetland restoration and ecology work in the Bay Area. And one of the things that was especially enlightening to us was the recreation of historical maps and imagery that was produced by looking at over many different documents. And as far as back as 1851. So what we have here on the right side is what we have been able to create as what was like the extent of the historical marsh around that time period. And you might be able to decipher that much of that historical marsh has now been developed in the Tam Valley and the city of Mill Valley area. And over the period of time from 1851 to what you see on the left as 1924, there was a lot of human development that happened that impacted the marsh's evolution. One of which had extreme impact was the railroad that went through what was at the time open bayland. And the railroad was elevated on a wooden trestle that spanned the open water. And we'll see in the next few slides that over time, embankment, but one of the things you might be able to see is the hashed sage green versus the solid sage green. So that's where sediment began to accumulate in what we now refer to as South Bothin. And this was probably largely due to the rapid colonization and logging of the sediment down marsh edge at that time. Next slide. And then moving on to about 1946, then the major change to the railroad was its conversion from a trestle to an embankment. So essentially we had a berm that was constructed along the edges of the tracks. And what that did was it inhibited the full tidal cycle from entering into the tidal marshlands there. and also caused sediment to be retained behind that embankment. There was also some changes happening at North Bothin, and in particular, during this period of time, there was a push to create levees and contain sediment behind those levees to make land, the wetlands developable, and to construct homes and other structures on it. And so that was the beginning of sediment being placed by human activity during that period of time. And there was one bridge, and Coyote Creek in particular was being pushed and to the edge of the hill to make way for development. And those actions also increased sediment transport to South Bothin as well. Next slide. Then as far as 1987, what we know as Bothin Marsh Open Space Preserve is largely what it is today. And that is, you can see a tremendous amount of time, amount of sediment had been trapped and had actually created enough elevation for tidal wetland species to be able to colonize South Bothin. And in the North Bothin, due to the environmental regulations at the time, the developers weren't able to develop this area, and it became basically undevelopable. And because of its elevation, there was also the ability for wetland species to become established in North Bothin too. But the big takeaways from here is that this North and South Bothin Marsh is really a relatively young wetland habitat and was almost entirely evolved because of the modifications happening since the mid 1800s. One last thing I'll point out on this slide is that you'll see that there's two bridges, and one is over Coyote Creek, and Coyote Creek at that time was entirely channelized and had no more connection to the marsh, to the tidal wetlands, and all that sediment was transported straight into the bay. And then the other bridge to the north of it was the only way for tidal wetlands to be able to get any action through that constricted opening. So we'll talk a little bit more about how that's affected the wetlands, but in particular, it has caused that South Bothin Marsh to be underwater for a longer period of time compared to other tidal wetlands that are fully open to tidal action. Now, this slide is most poignant to note how rapidly the predictions are for the loss of tidal marsh habitat at the preserve. And these are based on rates of sea level rise from the Ocean Protection Council for what is called a medium to high risk aversion to sea level rise. So these are 1 foot, 2 foot, and 7 feet of potential inundation over time, with 7 feet being approximately what is estimated to be end of century. So if we look at the different colors, where the high marsh is the dark green, the low to mid marsh is that sage green, and the mud flats being brown, you can see that there is a real sense of urgency, in particular to potential for loss of high marsh habitats, and potentially by as early as 2030. And we can see dramatic changes even at 2050, with end of century showing potential for complete loss of all of that marsh habitat. Next slide. So this is future sea level rise is, of course, a big concern to us, in the potential for loss of tidal wetlands, and not only for the biodiversity of the vegetation that exists there currently, but also for the species that is supported by that habitat. And in particular, a lower right picture of the Ridgway's rails, which is federally and state endangered species, is located at the marsh. And we have a population that has been supported and relatively stable for the last 8 years of monitoring that we've been doing. But in addition to the habitats and the species that utilize it, we also have a highly used trail that is important to the community, not only for recreation, but also for commuting. And the picture at the top and the bottom left show what that pathway looks like during a king tide event now, and even high tides coupled with a storm surge. So we're already seeing the effects of sea level rise at the preserve. And we want to not only plan for the safety of the community, but allow for safe access for those who use it to commute and travel to and from. But we also are extremely aware of other impacts from sea level rise, such as erosion of the marsh edge. With higher sea level rise, we have more erosivity from wave energy. And as I had mentioned, we have issues with sediment supply, with the marsh being choked off from sediment from the Coyote Creek and from the bay. And we also have prolonged inundation of tidal species, which are accustomed to being submerged, but there is a tolerance level, and we are seeing the effects of loss of some of the tidal wetlands in South Bothin in particular. So all of these things we are looking to address in our design work that we're doing to adapt to sea level rise. Next slide. So one of the ways that we want to ensure the success of planning to protect this tidal wetlands and other important wildlife is to make sure that the public is aware of what the future implications can be. So we've had a number of events with the public, and what you're seeing here are pictures of some of our events. And over a year-long period, we had like kayaking events, happy hour, scavenger hunts, visits to farmers markets, all to engage the public and to develop goals and objectives for the project. So these bullets are just three main goals for the project. And as you can see, what we've heard largely from the community is also the importance of improving the resiliency of the marsh and maintaining biodiversity, and being able to do that in ways that are innovative. In particular, we are extremely limited in space for wetland migration. So we're going to have to be creative with how we can create space for habitat movement. So we'll dive a little bit more into this at the end when we talk through the strategies that we're developing. Next slide. So at this point, I'm going to pass it off to Shelly. Shelly's work is part of our efforts to develop designs, but before we can actually develop any actual concrete designs plans, we want to make sure that we understand what we could potentially impact and how we could impact it and try to avoid it to the maximum extent. And so Shelly's work and Julian's are really important to the strategies that we create. Go ahead, Shelly.
Okay, thanks, Veronica. Hi, everyone. Next slide, please. So as Veronica was saying, one of the goals of this project is to protect the biological diversity found in Bothin Marsh. And in order to do that, we need a detailed accounting of what's there and where it occurs. And one way to do that is to create a vegetation map, because vegetation maps help us understand the plant composition in an area. It also helps us understand the different types of habitats that are present and the animals that use those habitats. And because vegetation maps are effective at conveying this type of information, they're often one of the first tools that resource managers will reach for when they're planning projects and developing conservation strategies. Next. Vegetation maps are important for documenting where rare vegetation occurs. So just as we recognize and protect rare plant species, we also recognize rare vegetation communities, and these are protected under the California Environmental Quality Act. Rare vegetation is referred to as sensitive natural communities. Vegetation goes through a conservation ranking process, and that ranking strategy is called the state rank or S rank. And S ranks of 1 through 3 are considered sensitive natural communities. Now, vegetation can be rare because it's dominated by a rare species like the Mount Tamalpais manzanita, or it can be composed of more common species, but the community itself is threatened. A good example is our native grasslands, and Idaho fescue grassland is one of those. Next slide. So before I get into our vegetation mapping project, I just need to go over a few technical details. Our project adheres to standards, national standards established by the U.S. National Vegetation Classification. And we use 2 resources to identify vegetation communities that the Manual of California Vegetation and the 2021 Marin County Vegetation Classification, which accompanied the recently released Marin County-wide fine-scale vegetation map. And I'll talk more about that map in a second. Next. So I want to introduce you to the structure of a vegetation classification system so that I can explain what the term fine scale means when we talk about fine scale vegetation mapping. So the classification, it takes a hierarchical approach to naming vegetation shown here, and it has 8 levels. So this is an example of a cordgrass stand or Spartina foliosa, and how it would be classified. So in the upper levels of the classification, vegetation is described very broadly using groupings like herbaceous vegetation, salt marsh. And it's really when you get to the bottom 2 levels of the classification, alliance and association, that's where you get into the detail about what species actually characterize the community. And so when we're talking about fine scale vegetation maps, we're actually mapping at the alliance or association level. And I just want to draw your attention to level 5, which is the macro group. Now that's considered coarse scale, and I'm going to reference that in the next slide. So next. So the starting point for our mapping project was the Marin County-wide fine scale vegetation map. So this map was released in 2021. It actually shows vegetation in its state from 2018 because that's when the aerial imagery was flown. But anyway, this map was released and it's an interactive web map. It was created using remote sensing. And herbaceous vegetation communities are notoriously difficult to map using remote sensing because herbaceous vegetation often doesn't have a distinct signature in the aerial imagery. So most fine scale vegetation maps, they actually treat herbaceous vegetation at a coarse scale at the macro group level. But the countywide map, this new countywide map, this is the first large-scale mapping effort that treated salt marsh vegetation at the alliance level. And so this map shows a portion of that countywide map that covers Bothin Marsh, and it identified 4 different vegetation communities. So yellow is Distichylus spicata, that's saltgrass. Orange is Grindelia stricta, that's gum plant. Red is Sarcocornia pacifica, that's pickleweed, and green is Spartina foliosa, or cordgrass. So the first phase of our project was to do ground truthing surveys to check for accuracy in this countywide map, and also to look to see if any vegetation types were missed. Next. So we use ground-based mapping techniques, and being on the ground, we were able to see vegetation types that are not visible using remote sensing. So we mapped a total of 60 acres and 132 polygons. We found 9 vegetation types compared to the 4 types that were found in the countywide map. And 7 of those types are rare. So the 2 types that are not rare are the Distichylus spicata annual grass community, which is shown in dark green. And then a new type that we recognized in this project, stands of Limonium californicum, or sea lavender. And so because this is a new type, it hasn't gone through that conservation ranking process. So all the rest of the types shown in our map are rare, and they include stands of Jaumea in bright yellow, stands of saltgrass and pickleweed in pale yellow, Frankenia salina, which is alkali heath, that's shown in blue. Orange is Grindelia. A mix of pickleweed, Jaumea, and saltgrass is the pale pink, and pure stands of pickleweed are shown in red, and then the pale green is cordgrass. So that new vegetation type that we recognized in this map, so it's not formally recognized in the Manual of California Vegetation. It has not been placed in the classification system. And so we're giving it a tentative name, and we're calling it Distichylus spicata Limonium californicum mapping unit. Now, it's not uncommon to find new herbaceous vegetation types when you do ground-based mapping like we did, because herbaceous vegetation is disproportionately undersampled compared to woody vegetation. And besides the saltgrass and sea lavender as components of this community, another notable species that was often present was the rare point-raised birdsbeak. Next. Okay, so I'm just going to finish up my portion of the talk by giving you a quick tour through the salt marsh so that you get a sense of what these vegetation communities look like. The photos really don't do them justice, so I hope you're able to come out on our field trip and so I can show these to you in person. So in the high marsh area, we mapped 2 vegetation types. We mapped Distichylus spicata annual grass, and that community was made up of saltgrass with other non-native annual upland grasses. And then we mapped Grindelia stricta association. Now, Grindelia stricta goes through these periodic die-offs in salt marsh habitats, and it's thought to be associated with increased salinities during drought periods. And so in this photo, the darker green shrubby plant, that is the Grindelia. And when we were mapping, Grindelia was, kind of young and small looking. So it kind of seems like it's starting to come back after a recent die-off. Next. Now, in the mid-marsh area, we mapped 5 different vegetation types, and you find 2 of them in the upper part of the mid-marsh, and one of them is Frankenia salina, Distichylus spicata. Now, this picture down here in the bottom, it's taken in the fall, so the Frankenia is kind of brown in color, but it's growing really thick and intermixed with the saltgrass. And when these two species are growing real thick like this, it can create this sort of hummocky texture in the salt marsh. And then the other type is the new type that we've recognized for this project, the Disticulus spicata limonium californica mapping unit. And this community is really showy when it's in full bloom. The sea lavender is just really gorgeous. And then I've also included a picture of the point raised bird's beak. And like I said, this species seems pretty strongly associated with this vegetation type. Next. Now, in the lower part of the mid-marsh, we have 3 vegetation types that have a lot of overlap in species composition, and they're not even visually distinct. Like there's a lot of just similarities in them, and basically they're confusing to sort out and they're confusing to delineate. And so these 3 types include the saltgrass pickleweed type, the saltgrass Jomea type, and the pickleweed Jomea saltgrass type. Next. Okay, so now we're in the low marsh, and you find pure stands of pickleweed growing just above our cordgrass stands. And our cordgrass stands were a mix of cordgrass with other herbs in the understory. A lot of times pickleweed, but there was also Disticulus and some Jomea in there too. And cordgrass, it occupies the lowest elevation in the salt marsh, just above the mudflats. So that is the end of my tour, and I'm going to pass it off to Julian.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here with you all. I'm Julian Geoghegan, Vegetation Specialist with Marin County Parks, and I'm here to talk to you about Chloropyron maritimum subspecies palustre, or point raised bird's beak. Its occurrence at Bothin Marsh and our efforts to map and monitor it there. Next slide, please. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this plant, but just to refresh our memories, I'd like to take a quick walk through the natural history of the species. It's in the family Orobancaceae, so it's related to our paintbrushes, owl's clovers, warrior plume, etc. It's an annual species which starts flowering in June and can go on flowering all through the summer. So it has a good long flowering season for us to enjoy. They have white club-shaped flowers tipped with bright purple, and each flower is sort of peeking out from behind an associated bract. These bracts, as well as the leaves, are usually tinged with purple, at least at Bothin Marsh. Some other populations are more of a glaucous green. Each plant usually has one vertical stem, often accompanied by one or more basally branching stems, giving it a sort of candelabra-like structure. It's quite small, only 10 to 30 centimeters tall, more often on the lower end of that range. They're halophytic, so they're salt tolerant, and they're also hemiparasitic. So they can parasitize the roots of neighboring plants, as well as photosynthesize to produce their own energy. They only grow in the upper salt marsh, often with Limonium, Frankenia, Jomea, Disticulus, and these species are naturally the host plants for Chloropyron. You can also find it mingling with pickleweed in some sites, but sort of only on the upper edge of the pickleweed's elevation profile in those more like mixed pickleweed stands that Shelly was talking about. And likewise, once you get like higher up into the Grandelia, you're not likely to find any Chloropyron. It is facing a number of threats. As we all know, the majority of salt marsh habitats have been lost over the last couple of centuries to fill, development, agriculture, etc. And while that process is mostly stopped, habitat loss to sea level rise is only going to accelerate into the future. On top of which, there are several species of invasive plants that invade salt marshes. We are working to manage those at Bothin Marsh. Happy to talk about that more if anybody's interested. Next slide, please. So here are a couple of maps showing the global distribution of the species on the left and the local distribution on the right. It ranges from the Oregon coast in the north all down to San Francisco Bay, which is a pretty long stretch of coastline. But you can also see just how isolated each of those populations are. There are hundreds of miles between them, which is another vulnerability as each population is essentially isolated. The species does continue south along the California coast as subspecies maritimum. And there's also an inland subspecies which occurs like east of the Sierras, which is pretty fascinating. So zooming into the map on the right, you can see a more local regional distribution, scattering of bayside sites with Bothin Marsh at the southern end, and then going up the coast, you have Bolinas Lagoon, Drake's Estero, Tamales Bay, and Bodega Bay up in Sonoma County. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so moving on to the mapping and monitoring segment. So starting last year in 2022, we decided to implement a monitoring program, and Shelly and I worked together to develop a protocol. And there's a few reasons that we did this, which I've listed here. Firstly, to map the population distribution within the marsh, so we have a clear picture of where it is, how much there is, where it's dense, where it's sparse, so forth. But also to document the natural fluctuations in density and distribution from year to year. Chloropyron maritimum is an annual species, so it has boom-bust cycles, usually dependent on environmental factors. So one year you might only have a handful of plants or even none, and the next year it's one of the dominant species on the landscape. This can be due to drought, rainfall, salinity, temperature, even just the timing of all these different factors together. And these cycles aren't necessarily predictable. That's not really what we're trying to get at, but just getting a sense of what these annual fluctuations look like for this species is really important for its conservation. Obviously, it's hard to tell what natural fluctuations look like in the era of climate change, when it seems like every year is some kind of extreme or another. But it's an important thing to look at. All right, third on my list there, oh, not ready yet. Third on my list there is to gain a better understanding of the habitat requirements of the species. Chloropyron has some very specific needs, particularly around elevation and vegetation. It only grows in a very narrow elevation band. It can't be too high, it can't be too low, it can't be too densely vegetated. It needs to have the right kind of vegetation. And so better understanding these requirements is going to be very critical to the conservation of the species, because its current real estate is not going to meet those requirements into the future as sea levels rise. The land it's currently growing on will become too low in elevation, start to transition to dense pickleweed or cordgrass, so on. Okay, last on my little list there is to monitor the effects of the project implementation. This project is going to have a pretty major impact on Bothin Marsh. It's going to be occurring in and around chloropyron habitat. One of the goals of the project is to actually create habitat for this and other marsh species. And this monitoring program will help measure the success of that. All right, next slide. Now, in order for this measuring to work, we can't look just at the project area, because if we did, we wouldn't be able to parse out the project effects from other potential causes, such as a drought, for example. So Shelly has also been monitoring some reference sites, which should allow us to kind of isolate the effects of the project. Here's a map showing the locations of those reference sites. The purple triangle at the bottom is Bothin Marsh. There's a reference site further north along the bike path or multi-use path near the middle school, another one across 101 on Strawberry Point, and a third to the north up by Larkspur Landing. All right, next slide. So these maps are a little bit busy, but here's what the resulting data looks like. The map on the left shows North Bothin Marsh with Almonte Boulevard on the west side. And the map on the right shows the area like around Tam Junction. So that's Coyote Creek flowing under Highway 1 there. This is just a subset of the data. These two maps don't cover the entire project area, because if I zoom out anymore, it's completely impossible to see these tiny little polygons. But if anybody's interested, I'm happy to share the full report and data set. So what we have here is spatial data. Each one of these little tiny colored polygons represents a patch of chloropyron, as well as a number showing how many individual plants there are in that patch. And then it's on this map, it's symbolized. So the darker color signals more plants and the lighter color fewer plants. This approach, it tries to strike a balance between resolution and efficiency. You know, this is not the highest resolution mapping imaginable, but it does accomplish our goals while being at a level of effort that is repeatable and sustainable over the long term. Because as you can see, it's quite a large area to cover. There are a lot of plants, and it takes a long time even to create this level of resolution. All right, next slide. So now we have all these cool data. What can we do with them? Well, until we get a few more years of data, we can't really compare them to each other to look for changes over time. But we can start combining different data sets and seeing what insights we can glean. So here is a map of North Bothin Marsh. And apologies, I've done that annoying thing where north is actually on the left side of the map. So that's the bike path running along the bottom. You can see the Tam High sports field kind of peeking up above the legend there. So the solid polygons, those colored polygons that you see, are Shelly's vegetation data that she just described in detail earlier. So the reddish brown color is the Spartina, the greens and the blues are the pickleweeds and the saltgrass. And notably, I'd like to draw your attention to the purple polygons, which are that Disticus spicata limonium californicum mapping unit that Shelly described. Now, overlaid on top of that is our 2022 chloropyron mapping data, which are those bright pink hatched polygons. And you can really see the preference, if you will, of the chloropyron for that saltgrass limonium plant community. Next slide. And here's a table of the same data, essentially, showing the percentage of mapped chloropyron in each of the vegetation types at Bothin. And you can see almost 80% of the chloropyron polygons intersect with that one plant community. And this is an example of the kind of analysis that's going to increase our understanding of the species and make our conservation strategies more effective. All right, next slide. So this is my last slide. It's just a few notes that I'd like folks to take away from this presentation and sort of remember in the context of the project. Salt marshes are dynamic landscapes. They move and they shift and they kind of grow and shrink, and that's all a natural process. Also, Chloropyron maritimum is an annual species that has evolved to survive in that dynamic landscape. It lies low in lean years, erupts in good years. It can colonize new habitats. It disappears from places that are no longer suitable habitat. But that said, it's also true that climate change and sea level rise are causing these changes to occur at a unprecedented pace. And many of the natural processes that species would rely on are no longer functioning, like, for example, the landward migration of marshes due to sea level rise that are now blocked by development. So given that situation, it might be a little unrealistic to expect the species to endure here unless we provide some sort of alternative means for it to do so. And that's one of the goals of the project. Climate change isn't something that we can fix, but we can try to adapt to it. And we should do what we can to conserve the species, during our lifetimes. Then at least future conservationists will have something to work with. And I'll just go out on this picture I took last week. It's just a little mound in Bothin Marsh, probably a remnant of dredging Coyote Creek, which you can see in the background there. There's a skeleton of some kind of tree indicating that this was higher ground at some point. And at the top of the mound, you have a few grindelia flowers popping up, and then there's a ring of limonium, and then you can see sort of a blush of purplish chloropyron at the base of the mound. And then it transitions to saltgrass and pickleweed below that. I just thought it was kind of a microcosm and sort of sums up what I've been trying to say in terms of sea level rise and chloropyron habitat and dynamic landscapes and so on. So that is all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian.
So I'm gonna, I think, very briefly just touch on how all of this work is informing the Evolving Shorelines Project and just what we are doing to enhance the tidal marsh with sea level rise and just enhance the habitats themselves. So with the Evolving Shorelines Project, Veronica mentioned, we're trying to address the issue with flooding along the multi-use path, and then also protecting the biodiversity of the marsh. And really, as we're thinking about how to adapt to sea level rise, we've really focused in on two major decisions. First being, how do we elevate that trail and where does it get elevated? And then on the flip side, we're thinking about how can we get sediment delivered to the marsh, coming from Coyote Creek as well as Richardson Bay. And both of those decisions have some interplay. Where the trail goes has a big influence on how we can kind of restore some of those natural processes to get sediment onto the marsh. So again, just to go over some of the existing conditions, the multi-use path kind of goes right through the middle of South Bothin and is a kind of a key barrier to some of that natural tidal processes of getting tidal interaction with South Bothin Marsh. And what we propose to do as far as the trail at this point is to remove it from its current location along that old railroad embankment and put it at the perimeter of the open space preserve and at the edge of the tidal wetland complex. and that will allow us to more fully restore these natural processes and functions. Again, the goals for moving the trail and taking measures to enhance the ecology of the marsh. One is by actually moving the trail, we can create a tidal inlet that is the right size for the amount of wetlands in South Bothin Marsh. By moving the trail, we can also restore that old embankment to conditions that will allow for high marsh to establish on that embankment. We're also looking at several features, such as digging new channels, new tidal channels throughout several parts of North and South Bothin Marsh to really improve drainage. Veronica mentioned how the marshes have really evolved over time in response to changes on the landscape, and the existing drainage doesn't really function properly, kind of as a relic of that evolution. So we're looking at how to improve that, and kind of in tandem with digging new drainage channels, we could use some of those spoils to create high marsh habitat adjacent to new channels, which is really important for the ridgeways, rails, as well as the marsh vegetation to get established in these higher elevation areas. And then, we're currently doing invasive plant management, primarily for some invasive limonium species, as well as Salsola soda. And there's some small populations of Lepidium or perennial pepperweed that are on the edges of the marsh that we're concerned about. So we are currently managing those kind of on a yearly schedule. We are also starting to look into ways to propagate chloropyron and other desirable native plants that we'd want to get established post-project after we do any grading out in the marsh. And then we're also looking at areas where we could actually establish upland and transition zone native species. There's a lot of areas of South Bothin Marsh in particular that have kind of a degraded upland area that's mostly full of invasive plants. So there's a lot of opportunity to restore that. And then some of the other key measures are that there's several areas of the marsh edge that's experiencing erosion from wave energy. So we're looking to establish coarse beaches, as in this upper right-hand picture. This is an example from Aramburu Island that's been successful to kind of dissipate the energy of those waves and just move gravel around instead. We're also looking at the potential for some artificial reefs that would also act as erosion control. And I just want to point out this bottom right-hand photo is an example of sort of that high marsh mound. You can see in the center of the photo, there's that greener vegetation, which is typical of a little bit higher elevation marsh. So this is just, I'll really quickly go over this plan for all of these marsh resilience features that I just described. Focusing on South Bothin Marsh, you can see we're proposing to excavate 4 new tidal channels that would connect Coyote Creek into the interior of South Bothin Marsh and reach all the way to some of the existing channels to, again, establish that natural circulation, hydrologic circulation. This is also showing that railroad embankment being restored to high marsh. Here's areas where there are upland habitat getting established. In the red along these kind of south facing and east facing parts of the marsh is where we would put coarse beaches, again, to dissipate that wave energy, which could also be coupled with some artificial reef structures. And then I'll also just point out that along the kind of the west side of the marsh, it is higher elevation currently, and we would establish some ecotone slopes, or just more gradual slopes, to allow for a transition zone for all of the vegetation, and theoretically the tidal marsh could migrate kind of up those slopes as sea levels rise, to give them the space to move. This map is also showing several areas where we think it would be compatible to put thin lifts of sediment that may be dredged from Coyote Creek. And again, that would be a tool to get some new elevation or higher elevation for that high marsh to establish on. That's not an element that's currently proposed in this project, but we're thinking about how it could be compatible with a future effort to dredge Coyote Creek. And really just to reiterate kind of our ecological goals that these designs would achieve, is that we're really trying to remove any barriers between the bay and South Bothin Marsh and Coyote Creek, and reestablish good tidal circulation. We want to remove those barriers to just create more ecological connectivity, create more opportunities for the plants and the animals to kind of migrate between North and South Bothin Marsh. A huge goal is to just get more sediment deposited in South Bothin. And we think by removing the trail from its current location in the marsh, it would have a great benefit to wildlife by just making it a little bit less noisy and having less visual disturbance from recreationalists and commuters along the trail. The habitat enhancements are really focused on, again, creating new channels and higher marsh elevation, creating those transition zones. And big picture with the project, we're just shooting for, at a minimum, no net loss of wetland habitat as a result of any of the project actions. And at our current 30% design level, we think that there's about an acre of disturbance that would be caused by building a new trail in the proposed location, but we can also restore about an acre of wetland habitat. So right now we're about on balance to not lose any wetlands. This is my last slide, and I think hopefully we still have some time for discussion. But I just want to acknowledge that the project currently is funded by the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, the Measure AA, and we've also had lots of other partners help fund and lend expertise to the project. And I'm going to kick it over to Veronica, or our host from CNPS, to just maybe talk through some of these next steps for our project, and just kind of get your input on some of the future studies we might consider, and just your ideas for our project. So
Thank you very much. Yes, Veronica, would you like to take us through these points here?
Yeah, I want to be conscious of everybody's time because we are almost at an hour. So I will put out there that we have a slide with Rob and my information. So if anybody would like to tackle any of these questions through email with us, you're welcome to do that. We can provide you with our slide deck so you can look at what we've presented, and maybe if some of you are like me, you might need some time to ruminate on something before you can come up with some ideas, but Rob and I are open to any conversation. And of course, Shelly and Julian can provide also additional info on the monitoring work that they're doing. But basically, what we would like for everybody to know is that like we're trying to think about like other studies that would be beneficial to understand the Chloropyron population, and what we would need to do to ensure there's success in maintaining their population at Bothin. And we're starting to think about like how we can propagate the species. It's rather challenging. We've been looking at what other work such as National Park Service has done to try to establish the Chloropyron and other restoration sites. I just want to also leave it open to CMPS members of ways that they could be involved. In particular, we're open to any kind of citizen science group that might want to form to help us monitor the populations of Chloropyron, or if you have other ideas on other ways you could be involved or would like to participate. This is a really good time for us to get ideas because we are only 30% into the design. So we still have a bit more work to do to solidify what we do in our strategies. And we want to be able to, connect to others' work who might, be able to inform ours as well.
Wonderful.
We had a few questions that were in the chat. Someone asked what your mapping unit was.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, for this project, we actually did not set a minimum mapping unit. And that's because we wanted to have the flexibility to be able to map some of these very small area communities, because in the salt marsh, a lot of the communities were functioning a lot like in a vernal pool. So they were very narrow, but yet long. Overall, they had relatively small area, but we still wanted to be able to capture them because, small changes in elevation, just like in a vernal pool, in the salt marsh, those small changes in elevation were giving us different community. It was for me to try to figure out what is a decent minimum mapping unit for the salt marsh. And I learned that I have to make it a lot smaller than what I typically use. I typically use, like when doing grasslands, like about a 30-meter diameter circle. That's about, I think that's about 700 square meters, but a lot smaller in the salt marsh.
Okay, great. Vernon probably and Doreen asked, did you find any Limonium durasculum in the Bothin Marsh? It does occur in strawberry.
Yes, we have found a lot of it. We've been managing both Limonium durasculum and Limonium ramosissimum at Bothin Marsh for maybe 10 years, quite a while. And one interesting thing we have noticed is that it used to be vastly dominated by ramosissimum. And over time, even though our management has been pretty successful, I would say, like the proportion of the population has shifted dramatically towards durasculum. And I think that is due to durasculum's very diminutive size, and it likes to hang out under the pickleweed, and it can flower when it's the size of a nickel, and over a much longer season. I'm sure you're familiar with the regional work that's going on with those two species. And I'm still very pleased with our success, but yeah, continues.
So a related question from Eva Buxton, was the flaming of the annual Limonium successful?
Yeah, so we flamed Limonium. It was probably mostly ramosissimum, kind of down by Mike's Spikes, like the south end of the bike path. And in that area, it was very dense infestation. almost more like, you know, a carpet-like growth pattern. And the flaming worked really, really well. But the thing is, it's probably only worth doing a couple, maybe 1 or 2 years in a row, because after that, the population gets down to a sparse enough level that it's easier just to hand pull it, and you're not having to deal with the fumes and fire. And it's actually really cool to do because it really knocked out the invasive Limonia, but all of the native saltgrass, Jomea, Frankinia, that stuff just sprang like right back up. It was really cool. But at this point, we don't really have anywhere left to do it because everything is down to the point where we would just hand pull it instead.
Okay. Michelle Carl asks, what are your thoughts on dredging projects nearby?
Well, we've been partnering with the flood control districts to look at ways to connect Coyote Creek to Bothin Marsh. And in particular, Roger Leventhal and Peter Bay had put together a feasibility study before we even started developing the Evolving Shorelines Project, looking at the potential for placement of dredge material on a Bothin Marsh. So we think that there, as Rob pointed out, some good locations where it could be piloted at Bothin. In particular, there hasn't been a pilot other than the Seal Beach project down near Long Beach on the West Coast. Most of dredge placement for at least habitat, benefits for wetlands has been done on the East Coast. So we are interested in if there is a dredging project, potentially making use of that sediment. Not sure if that was what the question was. So.
I think so. Larry Bathgate asks, are there any plans to perhaps increase the size of Bothin Marsh?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're completely surrounded by private lands that are developed, which doesn't really allow us that ability to expand. It would have to be, the only way we could is if there are considerable changes to like the zoning and regulation of shoreline properties that might allow for opportunities for private landowners to be interested in, conversion of development to open space. But we were able to purchase one small land, Caltrans land holding that was going through the preserve. So we have slightly expanded. So now that Caltrans parcel is now part of our open space.
Okay, great. So will sea level rise affect maybe the availability of some of those lands?
It will likely, yes. But unfortunately, like those landowners aren't necessarily thinking about that all right now. And so there isn't a large push for the community to start thinking about what we call retreat.
Okay. Kay Martin asks, what is the best place to see the bird speak?
Well, that probably depends on how muddy you're willing to get. You can find it pretty much all along the Mill Valley Sausalito bike path, multi-use path through the preserve. It actually really likes growing in that sort of transition zone along the multi-use path. There's sort of long strips of it. So that's probably the easiest place to see it. If you're willing to get your feet a little muddy, you can kind of traipse out into the marsh, and just north of Coyote Creek, there are what I think are dredge spoil piles, like from when they dredged Coyote Creek originally, and they just kind of dumped the spoils along the side. So you get these mounds. The Chloropyron really loves those little mounds sticking up out of the pickleweed. They can get very dense, and Also, the boardwalk along the south side of Coyote Creek, the McGlashan pathway. That's a really good place to see it because you're kind of out in the marsh above a lot of the marsh vegetation. But it's really not hard to find. If you go to Bothin and you start poking around at the right time of year, you're very likely to find it.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat. Kristen, you want to take over, remind people of the field trip?
Yeah, I think Larry just added something. Larry Bathgate.
Oh, yes. Why
about
cannot the marsh be expanded into the bay? Ooh.
That's a possibility, not one that we are entirely explored, partially because there is different divisions of land ownership, and not all subtidal lands are owned by the County of Marin or under the open space preserve. So we've kind of limited our strategies to those lands that we have management authority over. So that's the quick answer, but it is something that maybe others are thinking about in different projects around the bay.
Perhaps some of the dredging spoils can be used. Where were you thinking of testing those?
Well, it's not part of our project to pilot it, but we identified locations where it could potentially be placed in the future that's compatible with the project, which is along the edge of the multi-use path at along South Bothin, near where we're gonna create a new connector towards Tam Junction.
Good. Thank you. Well, I'm hoping that you will publicize some of your limonium eradication projects through our chapter. That might be one way to get people involved, and hopefully people will contact you with ideas and feedback as well. And just to remind everyone that there is going to be a follow-up field trip on July 18th at 10 a.m. and the details and the link to register for that are in our e-newsletter and on the website. And want to thank all of the speakers for a wonderful presentation. That was very informative, beautifully put together. And to let you know that our August speaker will be Sarah Jacobs, who is Assistant Curator of Botany and the Chair of Western North American Botany at the California Academy of Sciences. And she will be talking primarily about using paintbrush species to study species definitions, delineations. So hope you can join us for that. And thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Really excellent show. I'm looking forward to the field trip. Bye.